What happens when an old man comes to congratulate his grandson, and the latter treats him like a stranger? When the truth about the past turns out to be more important than a beautiful lie, the room falls silent. What happened next left the graduation ceremony speechless. The schoolyard smelled of perfume and overheated asphalt. Pop music blared from the speakers, the kind that sounds the same no matter where you are. Girls in frilly dresses, boys in suits, stiff and pompous, as if they were going to court instead of starting their lives. Parents fiddled with their phones, clicking away, capturing moments that would soon be forgotten. And into this shining picture he stepped. George entered the grounds slowly, a little late. Not because he was late, but because he walked slowly, as he was accustomed to doing, without rushing. He had walked halfway across Afghanistan in these shoes, black, worn, but shiny. He had polished them for almost an hour before leaving. On his shoulders was an old-fashioned jacket that hung on him like a bulletproof vest. He wore a white shirt without a tie, because he couldn't find one. His gray hair was pulled back into a ponytail. Under his arm was a neat brown envelope with the words, "For Jaden," written on it. No one met him. No one hugged him. He made his way through the crowd, trying not to get in the way, not to trip, not to step on someone's train or someone else's future. One of the teenagers glanced at him and snorted. "Look, someone's brought their grandpa to the prom. Is he yours?" Laughter, not malicious, just reckless, like young people. George didn't react. He'd heard it all before, in a different form, in a different country. Right now, one thing was more important: finding him. The boy. Jaden, his grandson. He saw him right away. He recognized him by his shoulders. He and his daughter had the same ones. Jaden was standing near the stage, his arm around a blonde girl in a blue dress. He was laughing, gesturing. He was handsome, a stranger. George approached him uncertainly, as if approaching a precipice. "Jaden," he said quietly. The boy turned around. At first his face showed surprise, then something hard, closed. He didn't say hello or how are you. He just squinted, as if he couldn't believe his eyes. "What are you doing here?" "I wanted to congratulate you. Today is an important day. I brought something." He showed him an envelope. There was a deafening pause. Nearby, a girl in a dress turned to Jaden. "Is that your grandfather?" The guy looked away, his face tensed. Just someone from the past. "Jaden," he tried gently as he had before when the boy cried over his biology grade. But now no one was crying, only the boy's lips tightened. "You shouldn't be here. Go away, before they call security." George stood there. He felt nothing. Only a light breeze blowing through his jacket and a burning sensation in his throat. His grandson didn't look at him. The girl giggled, and one of the guests turned away. "I'm sorry," was all he could say. His hand was still holding the envelope. The boy didn't take it. He didn't even touch it. "Go away, and don't come back. We have nothing to talk about. That's all." There was no drama. There were no screams. There was only this dialogue, which somehow erased everything at once. Half a minute later, a security guard approached him. A young man with an earpiece and a badge. "Excuse me, sir. This is a private ceremony. Are you on the guest list?" I just wanted to." "Then let me escort you out. No hard feelings." George walked away on his own. He was no longer there. He couldn't hear the music. He couldn't hear the fireworks. He couldn't hear the young people shouting in each other's ears. "We did it." He just walked, and he held the envelope in his hand, which he never gave away. Outside the school gates, it smelled of dust and something sticky, like the cheap hot dogs sold across the street. George stood against the wall, his back to the bricks. He didn't move. No anger, no rage, just silence inside. Like after an explosion, when your ears are ringing and you don't know if you're alive or dead. The security guard had already left. He didn't even wait for him to leave. He probably realized that this old man wasn't going to make a scene. He would just leave. And that was it. He took a cigarette out of his inside pocket, his last one, chewed up. He crumpled it between his fingers without lighting it, just held it between his lips. Then he took it out and carefully put it back in his pocket. He hadn't smoked since that hospital where they cut his heart. But habits are like shards. Sometimes they scratch you from the inside. He looked up at the sky. A drone was flying there. Someone was filming the celebration from the air. How beautiful it would look in a video, with lively music, in slow motion, with children tossing their hats in the air. No one would see how someone had been exposed. No one would know. No one would remember. He took out the envelope again. He stroked it. It was ordinary, brown. Inside was a photograph, old and yellowed. It was Jaden, about 6 years old. He was wearing a shirt with the wrong buttons fastened, laughing with all his might and holding a piece of wood in his hand. It was an airplane that he, George, had carved out of a baseboard. Back then, he still thought that everything would work out for them, that if they stayed together, everything would be fine. On the back of the photo was a caption, "You'll always be my little hero." He had written it on his birthday, the same birthday when Jaden had caught a cold and the two of them had baked a cake that burned. The laughter had filled the room. Back then it seemed like they could manage without his mother. Now it seems silly. He put the photo back. "We manage, yeah," he muttered. A woman walked by, probably the mother of one of the graduates. She looked at him with disgust, as if he were a drunk or a madman. He turned and walked away. His legs carried him toward the old stadium. He still remembered the way there. He and Jaden used to play ball there. It didn't matter that the goalposts had no nets. It didn't matter that you could only sit on concrete slabs. There was laughter there. There was life there. Now the field was overgrown. The goalposts were rusted. The asphalt was covered with moss. Everything was like him. Only the grass survived longer. He sat down on the edge of the stands. It was uncomfortable and bony. His body responded immediately. His lower back began to ache, and his knees shot out. 25 years of running in the mountains, and now I can't even climb stairs. He smiled to himself. He took out his phone, an old one with buttons. Stripes ran across the screen. A weak signal. In his message list, there was one chat called Shadows of Afghanistan. Yesterday he had written there, "Tomorrow is my boy's graduation. I'm going if they let me in." No one replied. He wasn't expecting a reply. But he opened the chat anyway. He read his message, and suddenly he felt sick. "Why, you old idiot? Did you even go there? Who needs you there?" He turned off his phone. He put it back in his pocket and just sat there, like someone who has nowhere else to go. Time seemed to stand still at the stadium. The sun was setting behind the trees, stretching the shadows, and George suddenly realized that he was still holding that damn envelope. He was still holding it, even though everything was clear. Everything had been said. It was over. But his hand wouldn't let go, as if giving it up meant finally admitting that it had all been for nothing. He shoved the envelope under his jacket, pressed it to his chest, closed his eyes for a second. A scene flashed before his eyes. Jaden running across the same field, small, with a shovel, shouting, "Grandpa, look, I'm digging a tunnel." They were building a secret base under an old flower bed, digging up dirt, eating apples from the ground, laughing so hard that both their sides ached. He thought then that he would raise his grandson properly, not like himself, abandoned, hardened by the army, not with words, but with love, quietly, stubbornly. But he didn't raise him. He took a folding knife out of his pocket, an old army knife with a chipped handle. He clicked the blade. It was a strange impulse, not so much to hurt himself, more like to cut off a piece of his shirt, wrap the photo in it, and bury it under the stadium, as if he could hide his shame, like he and Jaden used to hide candy from their mother. But then he closed the knife, put it back, let the shirt tear itself. There was nothing to whitewash here. He stood up. He walked along the concrete fence. He could feel evening approaching on his back. Summer smelled of dust, wet grass, and smoke from a barbecue somewhere nearby. It was funny. Someone was grilling meat and laughing, while a few blocks away stood a man who had been crushed by a glance today. He reached an old kiosk that was still open. The sign, drink/cigarette/water, hung crookedly. Inside was a guy in his 30s with the face of someone who didn't give a damn about anything. "Got any Pepsi?" George asked. "It's warm." "That'll do?" He took the bottle and sat down on the step next to it. No plan, no purpose. He watched the cars go by, the light change, the teenagers squeal on their scooters. None of it was about him. He opened the bottle, took a sip. The soda burned his throat, made him sneeze. He laughed, alone, hollow. "I came anyway," he said to himself, even though no one was expecting me. He was finishing his Pepsi when his phone rang in his pocket. It wasn't a ring, but a text message. He took it out. He glanced at it. One word. "Where are you?" Signed, Carl. He stared at the screen for a long time, as if trying to remember who Carl was. And then he remembered. Of course. Platoon, Bindoku's used Section Alta, Kabul. Carl was a radio operator. He saved his life back then, bandaged his artery under fire. He didn't reply, just put the phone back in his pocket. He sat there, staring into space. He didn't want to go anywhere. He sat by the kiosk until the streetlights came on. Someone flicked a switch somewhere in the city, and yellow patches of light spread across the asphalt like puddles after rain. The air became damp, as if the evening itself had exhaled, tired like him. The kiosk closed. The kid behind the counter slammed the door, lit a cigarette on the way out, and left without looking back. And George remained sitting on the concrete step, like an extra comma in someone else's sentence. He couldn't feel his legs, not because they hurt, but because they felt foreign. His whole body felt foreign. Everything around him was like a theater, where you forgot your lines and sit on stage in silence while the audience waits. He stood up, slowly. His fingers were swollen, his knee ached, but he moved. He didn't know where, just step by step, through neighborhoods where no one knew him, where no one would stop and say, "Hey, George, how's it going?" Because there were no such people left. At the intersection, he turned toward a gray box, a former apartment building, now a dormitory. His daughter used to live here with Jaden. He remembered every floor, every turn, every door with a peeling handle. It seemed to him that everything was still there, just as it had been. But now, only the smell of cheap paint and tobacco in the stairwell. The stairs were peeling, letters sticking out of the mailboxes. He went up to the 3rd floor. He stood at the door that had once been theirs. Now there was a sign with a stranger's name on it. Rodriguez. It must have been sold a couple of years ago. He didn't knock, he just stood there. He leaned his forehead against the door. He listened. Children's laughter came from inside. A boy was laughing, ringing, sincere. George closed his eyes. For a second, he thought it was Jaden, the 6-year-old with a shovel and snot, who was happy with a piece of cake. He stood there for about 5 minutes. Then he went downstairs. Everything outside was dark. The light was dim. The streetlights flickered like a heartbeat under anesthesia. George slowly crossed the street without looking around. The driver of a small car braked sharply and swore out the window. George didn't look back. He didn't care. It couldn't get any worse. He took out his phone again. Carl's message was still on the screen. "Where are you?" It sounded as if they had had dinner together yesterday, not buried a comrade 30 years ago. He wanted to reply, to write, "I'm here. Where are you?" But he changed his mind. He turned left toward an abandoned bus stop. He used to sleep there when he came to town and didn't want to bother anyone. There was a concrete bench, the smell of dust, and most importantly, no one else. The bench wouldn't betray him. It wouldn't turn its back on him. It wouldn't say, "You're nobody to me." The bus stop smelled musty and of old paper. Someone had left an advertising brochure on the bench. It was wet and stuck to the wood. George sat down next to it without brushing it away. It didn't matter. His back started to ache right away, but he didn't move. He sat as if waiting for a bus that would never come. Not in 5 minutes. Not in a year. Not ever. Because, to be honest, he didn't know where to go. There was no there. There was only here. Now, this bench, this night, this feeling that you've said everything, and no one heard you. He took out the photo, again, for the 3rd time that evening, as if he wanted to make sure. Yes, he had once held this boy in his arms. Yes, they had something in common besides their last name. He stared at the face, that Jaden was smiling so hard you could almost hear it. And somewhere inside, in his chest, something tightened, small, painful, as if rust had run through his bones. "So who are you to me now, kid?" he asked in a low voice. "If I'm not even your grandpa?" Of course, there was no answer. He remembered how, in Afghanistan, near Shindand, he and Carl had sat in a rock for 3 days without water until they were able to leave at night, and how Carl had said then, "You know when you feel like giving up, when you feel like going home, and when you don't have a home, you hold on tighter." And now the same Carl was writing, "Where are you?" Years later, after dozens of funerals, after losing his daughter, after being left alone. He took out his phone again. He typed a message, "I'm at the stadium," at the bus stop, alone. Then he deleted it. He sat down more quietly, because he knew that asking meant admitting that you were in pain, and admitting meant that you still had hope, and he had no hope left. He didn't want to leave his phone number, let it be as it is. He looked around. A car drove by slowly, with loud music playing. Someone shouted from the window, "Hey man, what are you doing sitting there? Go home." He didn't turn around. He just muttered to himself, "Home. Yeah, right." He was still holding the photo in his hand. He clenched it. He felt the paper crinkle slightly. He wanted to tear it up, but he couldn't. His hand wouldn't move. Instead, he stood up. He rested his hands on his knees. He pulled his shoulders back. And suddenly, he staggered. His head spun. His legs wouldn't obey him. He sank back down onto the bench. "Old age, damn it," he muttered. "It doesn't finish you off. It grinds you down." He lowered his head, closed his eyes, and just stayed there, without thoughts, without desire, just not moving. Because at moments like this, it's easier not to be than to be. Night had fallen at the bus stop. A warm wind blew in his face, carrying the smells of gasoline, hot asphalt, and wet leaves. It was stuffy, like before a storm. The city whispered, "Sleep, old man. You don't belong here." But George didn't sleep. He just sat there, like an old piece of furniture that no one cares about, but no one throws away because, well, it might come in handy someday. He glanced at his shoes. They were polished, almost to a mirror shine. He had rubbed them in the morning, like a soldier before inspection, because he knew he couldn't go to his son looking dirty, even if that son doesn't call you. "Idiot," he said to himself. "Clean shoes won't save you if you're already gone." He took out his phone again. Just because. Like a smoker reaches for a cigarette even if he's quit. Just because his hands don't want to be empty. And there was a new message, from Carl again. "Answer. We're nearby. We haven't forgotten." He stared at the screen. For a long time. As if he couldn't believe his eyes. Nearby? Who is we? His fingers trembled. He wanted to reply. To write something. Anything. Even a single letter. But he couldn't. Not out of stubbornness. Out of fear. Because what if it was true? And then what? What would he say to the people who remembered him as young, strong, alive? What would he say to those who had seen him when he was real, not this broken old man who had just been kicked out of his life? He sat down deeper, closed his eyes. 10 minutes later, he heard someone approaching, not just one person, a few steps, heavy, calm, like soldiers on parade. He didn't open his eyes. "George," the voice was hoarse, uncertain, but alive. He raised his head. 4 figures stood before him. Their faces were indistinguishable in the darkness, but their silhouettes were recognizable. One had a cane. Another was broad-shouldered, with gray hair. Carl. "How did you know?" George asked hoarsely. "We always know our own," he replied. And that was it. There were no hugs, there were no cries, just a look, the kind that doesn't need an explanation. "Let's go," Carl said. "There's nothing for you here." "Where?" "It doesn't matter. The main thing is not to be alone." George stood up. His legs felt like jelly. His heart was pounding. But he walked, slowly. Next to him were those who had been with him in the sand, in fear, in pain. Those who didn't ask, "Who are you to me?" They walked toward the darkening neighborhood, silently. Only the streetlights winked at them like old friends. They walked silently, not looking at each other. Carl was in front, limping slightly as he always did after the shrapnel wound he'd received near Kandahar. Behind him was Chong, his jacket pulled up to his chin, his face looking as if he were still on a mission. Tommy had an eagle tattoo on his arm, now hidden beneath patches of pigmentation. And Daniel, the one with the cane, walked with his back straight, not because of weakness, but out of principle. George walked between them, feeling no weight in his body. They didn't ask questions. They didn't sympathize. They didn't pat him on the shoulder. They just walked beside him, and that meant more than any words of encouragement. At the turn, Carl stopped. "Now tell me," he said, without turning around. "What did he say to you?" "Who?" "Your grandson. What did he say?" George clenched his teeth. There was a pause. "He said I was a disgrace, that I'm nobody to him." "I see," Carl replied dryly. Tommy whistled. "Yeah, looks like time is rewriting your biography after all." Daniel spat to the side. If only the kid knew who carried him out when the armored personnel carrier was hit, or who carried his mother when she was barely breathing from asthma. And now, he's a disgrace. "It's not his fault," George said hollowly. "He was taught that way." Carl nodded. "It doesn't matter. Words are a choice, even when you're young and stupid." No one else spoke. They turned the corner. Ahead of them were the lights of the school. The prom was still going on. Laughter, camera flashes, a buffet under a tent. The music changed to the song they play for the last photos. "All together, class of 20 _." George stopped. "I don't want to go there." Carl turned around. He stared for a long time. "We're not taking you. We're going for him." "For whom?" "For the boy who forgot where he came from, and for the one who will remind him. You can stay if you want. But know this, he has to understand who you are at least once in his life, not for your sake, for his own." George stood there. The seconds lasted an eternity. His hand touched the envelope under his jacket again. The photo. It was there. Proof that at least someone once knew that he wasn't a disgrace. Carl waved his hand, and they walked away. Straight toward the entrance, he watched the old men's backs disappear into the lights, and suddenly he felt his legs move on their own, slowly, but firmly. They entered without permission, without invitations, without badges. They just opened the gate and went in, and not a single security guard dared to block their way, because there was something in each of their faces that cannot be explained in words, but you feel it immediately. The crowd parted, slowly, not out of fear, but out of incomprehension. People instinctively took a step aside. Some stopped eating, some hid their glasses. Someone whispered, "Who are they?" A girl in a yellow dress with a bow on her head looked at Carl and asked, "Are you Jaden's grandfather?" Carl smiled slightly. "No. I'm one of those who knew his grandfather when he was not an old man, but a force of nature." George followed them, slowly, with his back straight. He was no longer holding the photo. He was holding his gaze, straight, clear, no guilt, no expectation, just there. And then the scene. Jaden was on the podium with a microphone in his hand. There was laughter and applause all around him. He was talking about the future, about gratitude, about those who had helped him grow up. And of course, I want to thank my father, who was always there for me. George froze. Carl stepped forward, loudly, clearly, without malice. And your grandfather? Silence. Everyone turned around. Jaden froze, shock in his eyes, panic on his face. That's him, he stammered, pointing at George. I told you. Carl interrupted. You said he was nobody, but we'll tell you who he is. He turned to the hall. This man once pulled people who couldn't scream out of a burning armored car. This man fed a boy when his mother died. This man is not just a grandfather. He is the part of your memory that you erased because it was more convenient for you. A dead silence hung in the hall. Even the music stopped. One of the teachers slowly put down his glass. A woman from the local committee wiped her eyes. Someone took out their phone. Someone else, on the contrary, put theirs away. Jaden stood there as if stunned. He looked at George. He didn't know what to do with that look, because for the first time in his life, it wasn't judgment, it wasn't resentment. It was just a fact. I'm here. George didn't say a word. He just stood there in the middle of the prom, in the middle of the music, the candles, the balloons, the costumes, the scarves, and the lives of strangers that he didn't belong to. He didn't interrupt. He didn't explain. He didn't wait for someone to suddenly burst into tears and rush into his arms. Number? All that was in the movies, not in his life. Jaden came down from the stage, slowly, as if his legs had turned to jelly. There was no anger or shame on his face, only confusion. For the first time, it was real. Why did you come? He breathed. Because I was sure that someday you would look me in the eye, George replied calmly. I thought, don't. I've thought a lot too, for years. How to help you, how to be there for you, how not to get in the way, but everything I came up with turned out to be unnecessary. Carl came closer and stood behind George. The others gathered around them, shoulder to shoulder, not as protection, as a silent reminder that he was not alone. But you said he abandoned you, said the girl standing next to Jaden, that he drank, beat your mother, and left. You said so yourself? George didn't move. He just twisted the corner of his mouth slightly. It's nice to have a good story, especially if you're the victim and someone else is to blame. Jaden turned away. He clenched his fists. I was a kid. I was just told, now you're an adult. You can choose who to believe. The words hung in the air, hollow but without threat, no offense, just like a nail in a wall, hammered in, and that's it. If you want to know who I am, ask me. Not your stepfather, not your mother, me, or don't ask. That's also a choice. George took an envelope out of his inside pocket. He held it out. This is for you. There's a photo inside. You were little then. You were smiling like you haven't smiled in a long time. Jaden took it carefully, as if he were holding something fragile in his hands, not cardboard. He looked at it, froze, and for a second, something familiar flashed across his face. He began, but Carl said quietly, enough. Words later, right now, remember. And they left, without hurrying, past people, past glances, past a life that didn't expect those it had already written off to burst into it. George didn't look back. He knew that everything that needed to be said had already been said. They left the schoolyard and immediately turned aside. No conversation, no memories. Silence led the way. Silence followed behind. They walked as they had once walked in the mountains, one after the other, at an even pace without distractions. George walked in the middle. His shoulders ached, his knee ached. But he didn't feel weak. He was tired, but not the kind of tired that needed to be cured. It was just there, like a scar on his chest. healed but still crunchy when the weather changed. "Where are we going?" he finally asked. Carl waved his hand. "There's a diner over there. We hang out there sometimes." Coffee was like gasoline, but no one was in a hurry. "Sounds good," George nodded. There really was a coffee kiosk there, plastic chairs. Against the wall stood a cracked trash can, smelling of burnt paper and something with a sickly vanilla scent, as if someone had spilled cheap air freshener. The table was wobbly, the light was cold, but it was all theirs. They sat down. Everyone ordered something simple. George ordered black coffee, no sugar. Tommy took out a flask and poured himself a drink. No one said a word against it. "So, how are you?" Daniel asked. "What do you mean, how am I?" replied George. "I thought it couldn't get any worse. Turns out it can, but it's not killing me." Carl nodded. "It's not killing you. That's a good day." They sat there in silence, watching the cars go by. People rushing somewhere, laughing on their phones, carrying bags. Everyone had a life. They had an evening that smelled of instant coffee and something old, not sad, just old. "Thanks for coming," said George, "not just for show, just because." "We couldn't not come," said Chang. "We weren't just together. We came back together. That's different." "And then everyone scattered," Tommy muttered. "And then yes," Carl agreed. "But if one of us calls, you go. No questions asked, even if you didn't call. We knew you wouldn't ask." George looked at them, those faces, those wrinkles, those hands with spots, burns, and tremors. They were all his past, his only street that hadn't changed its name. They sat in the diner for almost an hour. They drank coffee that quickly grew cold. Sometimes someone said something, but mostly they were silent. It felt like everything important had already been said, not with words, but with their presence. Everything else was just noise. On his third cup, George lit up. It was his first cigarette in 10 years. He took a slow drag, as if he were trying to remember something long forgotten. The smoke went into his lungs sharply, like a rebuke. He coughed but didn't stop. "I knew you'd crack," Carl grinned. "I didn't break down. I remembered," George snapped. The laughter was quiet, tired, real, like those who know that dawn is not hope, but just another day to live through. "What are you going to do now?" Chang asked. "Are you going back?" "Why wait? No one's waiting for me. The apartment is empty. The TV is silent. The radio is stuck. I sat by myself for a while, and now I've sat with you. It's someone else's turn." "Come stay with us," Tommy suggested. "I've got a trailer. There are 2 beds. My wife sleeps with the dog anyway. We'll make do. I've got a can of stew left. Almost real." "Thanks, Tom, but no, I have to get back. While my legs still work, I have to keep moving, not just sit around." They all understood. They didn't try to persuade him. "Let us know if—" Carl began. "I won't, but if you do, find me yourself." George grinned. They got up, paid for their coffee. The cashier, a young woman with candy-colored nails, looked at them with slight suspicion. Old men in dusty jackets with looks that made you want to look away. But at the same time, no lies, not a word, not a glance. George paused half a step at the exit. He looked back. On the wall was a plywood board with a heart cut out of it, into which someone had stuck 2 paper soldiers from magazines. It was funny and ridiculous, but damn it, it was true. He smiled. Still, sometimes even paper has a soul. Carl slapped him on the shoulder. "Go, but don't disappear. Disappearing is expensive. It's easier to be forgotten." "We know how to do that too," said Chang, "but not with our own people." And they parted ways, each into their own darkness. George headed for the bus stop. In his pocket, he had his phone, a pack of cheap cigarettes, and a crumpled photograph, and the feeling that today, at least someone had seen him. The bus stop smelled of ozone. Somewhere in the distance, the first raindrops hit the asphalt, followed immediately by the second and third. George stood under the shelter, holding his ticket in his hand. The bus was due at 10:45 p.m., 20 minutes to go. Time to just wait it out, without thinking, without hope. He looked at his palms, dirty, cracked, with short nails and old calluses. These hands had held an automatic rifle, an iron, a spoon with baby food, an empty glass, the throat of his own grief, and they could still hold the weight of something important, at least himself. An envelope lay on his knees, the very same one. He never took the photo back from Jaden. He didn't even ask if he had looked at it. "It doesn't matter," he exhaled. "It's not mine anymore." A man sat down next to him, young, with a backpack and wires coming out of his ears. He glanced over, then he asked, "Tired, Grandpa?" "Yeah," George replied hoarsely. "Life's been carrying me around. It's heavy, damn it." The guy smiled, but didn't understand. Young people don't understand until they get tired themselves. And thank God for that. A couple of minutes later, the bus arrived. It was white, with a peeling side and a creaky door. The driver, wearing glasses and a baseball cap, waved his hand. "Where to?" "Back," George replied. "Somewhere quiet." He sat down by the window. No one took the seat next to him, as if people sensed that it would be difficult to be near him. It wasn't because of the smell or the way he looked. It was because of the silence he carried within him. The bus started moving. The windows fogged up. Outside was a city that owed him nothing. No words, no apologies. At the turn, he mechanically took out his phone. The screen lit up. One message. "Are you still my grandfather?" No signature, but from the mistakes in wording, he knew it was Jaden. He stared at the screen for a long time, then he slowly typed, "I always was, even when you didn't know." He pressed send. He closed his phone, put it in his pocket. The rain intensified. The drops tapped on the glass like fingers on a coffin lid. Rhythmic, calm, relentless. But inside, for the first time in a long time, he wasn't empty. The bus shook on the bumps like an old boat on a river, not caring who it was carrying. Trees flashed by outside the window. The light from the street lamps flickered in the glass like a heartbeat. George sat huddled against the back of the seat, his fingers clasped together, his eyes closed. He couldn't sleep. Not because he was anxious. His body simply didn't know what to do with all the tension that had built up. He felt as if he weighed twice as much. It was as if the words, the looks, the silences, everything he had experienced today had been absorbed into his muscles, his joints, his spine. And now he was carrying around someone else's weight. At some stop, a child got on, a girl of about 10, with a backpack and a sweater down to her knees. She sat down opposite him. She stared at him. "Are you a soldier?" He opened his eyes. He looked at her. "Why do you think that?" "Your face. It's like my grandfather's, when he was silent. My mom said, 'Leave him alone. He was in Vietnam.'" George nodded. "It looks like your mom is right. Were you there too? Somewhere where everything is, well, bad?" "I was," he said quietly. "Where you learned to breathe again." She nodded. Then she took a chocolate bar out of her backpack. "Would you like some?" He hadn't eaten sweets in 10 years, but he took it, a small piece. It was brittle. "Thank you. Are you going to see someone?" He looked out the window. "Number, I'm going home." "Is it far?" "It used to be closer. Now I don't know." She didn't understand, but she kept quiet, and he was left alone again. Only this time, without the familiar feeling that everything was lost. Pain, yes. Bitterness, yes. But loss, number. As long as someone asks you a question, you haven't disappeared. He opened his phone, checked his messages. Nothing new. But that was enough. "Are you still my grandfather?" He reread his reply. Then he turned off the screen. He still had several hours of driving ahead of him. And for the first time in many years, he didn't want to get out halfway. He returned in the early morning. The street in front of his house was empty. The store on the corner wasn't open yet. The dogs weren't barking. Even the mailbox, usually stuffed with advertisements, was empty. George put his bag by the door and slowly took out his key. The apartment greeted him with silence and the smell of old furniture. The air was stagnant, like in a basement. He didn't turn on the lights. He just walked into the kitchen and threw his jacket on a chair. He sat down. He pulled the ashtray toward him. He didn't smoke. He just held the cigarette like an anchor. On the wall was a clock with the unit's emblem. It hadn't worked for 3 years. He glanced at it and smiled. Everything's in its place. Even time had stopped. He took off his shoes and walked barefoot across the cold floor. He opened the refrigerator. It was empty. Just a jar of mustard and 2 eggs. He closed it. On the nightstand was a stack of books, dusty. On top was a bookmark. Page 74. He hadn't opened it in a year. He sat down in an armchair. He reached for the box of letters. Inside were notes from his daughter, a check from Jaden's first paycheck, a drawing of the 2 of them drawn with crooked markers, a child's handwriting. "Grandpa, you're like Superman, but without the cape." He took it out and looked at it for a long time. "Yes, boy, without a cape, and without flying, only falling." There was an unexpected knock at the door. Dry, single, he wasn't expecting anyone. The neighbors rarely knocked. If they came, it was only when a pipe leaked. He approached without turning on the light in the hallway. He looked through the peephole. No one was there. He was about to return when he noticed something lying on the doorstep. A white bundle. He opened the door and picked it up. It was an envelope, just like the one he had been holding all this time. Only the handwriting was different. Inside was a photograph. The same one. It had returned. And on the back, in new handwriting, with a mistake, but clearly legible. "I don't know how this works, but if you don't mind, maybe we could try. Jay." He sat down by the door. He didn't go back to the kitchen. He didn't turn on the light. He just sat there. And for the first time in a long time, he felt that he wasn't the only one who still remembered. He woke up to light. Ordinary light. Sunlight. A ray was shining through a crack in the curtains, falling on his chest and tickling his chin. George squinted, not immediately realizing where he was. Then he remembered. Yesterday. The bus, the coffee shop, the photo, the envelope, the night, the letter, his handwriting, uncertain but honest. He sat down on the edge of the bed. His back ached, but not like before. The pain was quieter, as if tired of its own self-importance. He walked over to the window. The courtyard was just a courtyard. An elderly woman was shaking out a rug. Children were playing ball. A man in shorts was swearing at pigeons. Everything was as usual, and that was good. In the kitchen, he boiled the kettle. He poured the last spoonful of tea into his cup. He fell back into his chair. He watched the tea brew, and he thought. Not about Jaden, not about Carla, not about words, just about life, about how you can go all the way, end up with nothing, and still not be empty. The clock on the wall was still not working, but he didn't bother changing the batteries. Let it be. It's a memory. Not everything needs to be fixed. He walked over to the nightstand. He took out an old box of postcards. He leafed through it. He stopped at one. It was blank. He sat down at the table. He picked up a pen. He thought, "Jaden, I don't know if this will work, but if you ever decide to, I still have tea and conversation. And you can always knock, even if you just want some quiet." He didn't sign it, not because he was ashamed. He just knew he would find out. He put the letter on the windowsill, not to send it, just so it would be there. Sometimes it's enough just to know that you still exist, and that someone else knows it too. He poured himself some tea. He took a sip. A bitter taste remained on his lips. And that was good, because a living mouth can taste bitterness. And that means it's alive. Have you ever felt forgotten by those you lived for? If this story touched you, write the word "I remember" in the comments. Let those who have gone through pain in silence understand that they are not alone.